So I had made a discussion, a talk piece, a conversation, a monologue earlier, thinking about Dante and the beginning in particular of Inferno, the way that he finds himself lost and focusing on that idea of finding oneself lost and the paradox of that particular formulation. And I had been thinking about this, not only because the 700th anniversary of Dante's death is marked in a strange sort of way by a project to launch Inferno into outer space. But also by the way that the reinvestment of the myth of the colonial traveler is being raised again, almost like raising the spirit of the dead, as is done in Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus, summons the spirits of Achilles and other fallen heroes, to elicit their knowledge of the other world. And I had thought about some of the ways that journey as a metaphor for knowledge, but also as a metaphor for seeking and acquiring, functions in a society in which it seems, at least, that we have the technological capacity to save our world, and yet our personal interests and our desire to live in a certain way, accumulate certain objects, participate in a way of experiencing the world interferes with the common sense of being able to see, clearly the destruction that we're causing, and that particularly the human investment in the economic structures of capitalism is not sustainable for the survival of our planet, and it's becoming increasingly obvious. So obvious, that at this point that that anyone who doesn't see it, really clearly has to be willfully, closing their eyes to the obvious facts of the destruction. So we've had summers that have had the highest recorded temperatures in recorded history, and we've had extended winters, and we already see, if you go to the grocery store and you look at the produce, you notice that most of it isn't even produced in the United States. California is not the breadbasket, or fruit basket or vegetable basket of the nation anymore. We don't, in the United States, even really have the resources to feed ourselves any longer. And the result, is, that we import food from across the world. And the effects of that, are that nations produce food for us rather than for themselves in order for certain people to profit, which means that we starve the world. And the reason that we starve the world is that we've poisoned our own nation. And we've poisoned it in more than one way. We've poisoned it ideologically as well. And that's not to discount the fact that we make, certain kinds of progress in certain things. I mean, I have a big checklist of things that I would like to accomplish, and I can check off, Bears Ears. I can check off, we removed Trump from office. I can check off, certain kinds of awareness of certain issues, but, the struggle, for example, like, there's certainly an awareness of the uranium contamination on the Navajo Nation, and there are even contracts that have been granted to, to begin the process of decontamination, but the actual work is another thing, I always think of certain kinds of moments as like limited windows, so that now that we have Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary, certain things can get done, but if they don't get done within a narrow window, things will go back to being a closed door, right? So, so that when there's a window available, one works, diligently around what can be accomplished within that window. And then when the window closes, one seeks another window or door, portal, the opening of a gate of opportunity, one might say. So, so I was thinking about, these mythological fantasies that people like Jeff Bezos construct around, the hero, adventurer, deep space, seafarer, captain who, recognizing that, this planet is doomed, which it certainly wouldn't be, other than the fact that people like Jeff Bezos do everything that they can to make money and destroy the planet. But that construct these new fantasies around colonization of space and, so if we destroy this world, we can move on to another. And I've said since I began saying things back in the 70s that if the reason that we're destroying this world is for certain people to become wealthy and for capitalism to continue to function as the monster that it is, out of control, there's no reason to think that we're any more capable of inhabiting another world. And the idea of destroying a habitable world and being blind to its destruction because you fantasize that you can create a habitable world out of an inhabitable world is a form of insanity, because that really doesn't make any sense. It's like saying that it doesn't matter if your crops rot in the field. We'll just figure out a way of eating dirt. I think it's more reasonable to try to nurture the crops so that you won't have to figure out a scientific way to turn the dirt into something edible. There's already a way to do that. We were designed through long eons of physical and evolutionary history to interface with this world. And that's what we are. That's what we do. We're beings of this world, and being beings of this world, we're granted certain advantages, like our lives are nurtured by its systems, and one of those systems is precipitation, and our lives are nurtured by water. And in a very real and almost non-metaphorical sense, water is life. Water is, that combination of elements that make all life on Earth possible. So not respecting it shows a very limited understanding of what life is. And I had recently done a piece, I'm very critical of the sort of narcissistic and pathological lack of empathy or understanding of the rights of life to have life, of people like Christian Book, who takes a species and writes on its genes a poem. I mean, it makes the Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel seem like a fairly innocuous and benevolent figure. By comparison, and I guess one could argue that, well, these are unintelligent creatures, so it's okay for us to do whatever we want with them. But by extension, you would have to argue then that it's okay for intelligent human beings to do whatever they would want with other less intelligent human beings, which I don't think anyone would argue. And that connection between this vision of Bezos as like the supreme decider of fate, or the ship's captain, sort of one who has made more profit on the human destruction caused by the COVID virus than anyone in the world. And at last count, the profit that Amazon has made in in the period of the coronavirus was $40 billion, and it was largely at the expense and cost of the health of Amazon workers, whose rights and whose uh, expectations, for safe and healthy working conditions were, um, all but thrown into outer space uh, by this, monster machine. And then the profits of that destruction and that lack of caring, being reinvested in this ego machine of the explorer being launched into outer space, and it's not just the connection with Dante and whatever group it is that want to launch Inferno into outer space, and how this sort of reiterates the Golden Voyager project of launching human culture into outer space, and how the articulation of that human culture was like highly colonialized, right? And even the launching of it as like this representation of who we are, this much more than just a time capsule, like was like the county fair, like the development of certain kinds of display, the the Lord's uh, the Lord's property on display, the master's possessions being shown, to the county. Um, it was constructed as a very propertied and proud venture, in a similar way to what we see going on with the launching of Dante and the launching of Bezos. But beyond that connection, it occurred to me that something interesting in Dante and this way of seeing as seeking. So when Dante ventures into hell, which largely he constructs, there's nothing in the gospel. Dante is an early Christian, right? So one would think that his construct of the afterlife would reflect whatever the founder of Christianity's construct of the afterlife might have been. But in fact, there's nothing in the gospel or any record that we have of the teachings of the figure of Jesus Christ that refer to any sort of hell whatsoever, and that's largely constructed out of the imagination of church builders and an afterthought that grows out of the way I would argue that all hells are forms of Societas. What the anthropological theater theorist Victor Turner refers to as Societas as opposed to CommUnitas. CommUnitas is this opening of the human heart and spirit to the community of others and world and cosmos, a kind of exploration of the psychological function of flow as communication, and Societas is the closing of that. You are not one of us. You don't belong to the community. When words like, when the Dene use a word like Biligana, it's, you don't belong to us. When the word Gentile is exclusive that way. The word infidel is exclusive that way. So there's an initial opening, I think, in all spiritual processes, and enlightened ones, and then there's a closure. And so I wanted to talk about that closure today in hell, and who are, what hell, represents in terms of that closure. And I was thinking about Dante and Dante has a guide when he goes to hell. And his guide, the guide that he chooses is Virgil, the Roman architect of the Adventures of Aeneas, and this myth of the founding of a nation, right? So I think it's relevant that the guide to hell is this one who constructs this myth of Rome as belonging to this mythological past. And Aeneas, is driven from his home, by the destruction of his world, in the Trojan War, and then ventures, and he in the course of the adventures in the Aeneid, Virgil has Aeneas, meet various sibyls and have various encounters with spirits unlike himself, and ventures into these other worlds and underworlds, and in Aeneas' case, these sibyls are often his guides, and some ghosts as well, and it makes a kind of sense for Dante to think that this is a model, and that the one of the ways that he can imitate this model is just to bring. He doesn't bring Aeneas into the story. He brings in the poet. So the poet is the poet master of the idea of venturing into the underworld with a guide. Now there are much older narrations of ventures into the underworld, in which individuals go into the underworld without a guide, and and the oldest one is probably the story of Inanna or Ishtar, who ventures into the underworld to bring back a loved one, and this is probably the oldest narration of and structure for a venture into the underworld. Now, when Dante goes in, it's not to bring back a loved one, but rather to see, and to construct, like he wants to construct this world, like Bezos, wants to construct this myth of this possibility of, if we destroy our world, like maybe by not paying attention to truth, when we sell these books that tell us that we don't need a vaccination, or we sell all these products around, the COVID virus, and our only intention is to make a profit, not to tell the truth or not to save the world, that's okay, because, we have this myth, we can move on, right? So it's in a way a myth like the myth told by Virgil, where you leave this world and you find a new world, and we can always invent Rome, and Romulus and Remus can always be suckled by the wolf, and And but there's an older, there's an older story of why one ventures into the underworld. And I think I touched on this before when I did a piece that I talked out in the dark. And it's this story of retrieval. You venture into hell, and you do so you're on your own, and it's like venturing into the shadow, right? And you do this because you can't uh, you can't accept that this one that you love so much has been torn from you, and you realize that you may be destroyed in this venture, and yet you go anyway. And this is Inanna's journey, and um, it becomes Hekate's journey in Greece, and then later it's sort of transmogrified into the Orphic journey for Eurydice, and it's initially, and just like in the old Babylonian and Sumerian uh, and Assyrian and Hittite cultures, where that story of adventure, takes on a patriarchal kind of reconfiguration when Gilgamesh, you know, uh, journeys into the underworld. Um, in Greek culture, it does the same thing, and it becomes, Orpheus, takes on Hecate's role and journeys into the underworld, seeking, his lost love, Eurydice. But it's still, the model for that journey begins as as the woman's journey into darkness, to recover loss, and it's not in a certain way altogether different from the way that uh, in 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 some of the stories after the Trojan War, Helen gathers up all of the names and stories of the dead, those who died because of her, and this is her way of retrieving, that loss, and it's also embodied in the story of Isis, who gathers up all of the torn pieces of of the body of her husband Osiris, and who's destroyed in a battle with this evil one, Seth, and uh, I've been thinking about the way that these two ventures, or two different kinds of ventures into not, two different kinds, meaning the adventure into hell that retrieves the lost one, and the adventure that Dante takes into hell as the kind of building of an empire of the dead, or exploration. It's a colonial exploration of the underworld, right? In a way, like to see like what's there. But that requires a guide, and I was thinking about like how interesting that is, that requires a guide. And there are certain kinds of adventures, like that have required guides, right? The Western expansion, and there are certain stories of native guides, Lewis and Clark, and oh, and I'm sure there are many others, but the story of Sacagawea is in a way, another version of this kind of myth. And the myth of the explorer that's moving into such unknown territory that the only way to navigate it is to find someone that belongs to this other world. And for Dante, that one who belongs to this other world is one who has already passed away, but also one who has preceded as a model of this notion of venturing with a guide, as opposed to venturing without a guide. And I thought about these stories of enlightened ones who encounter these places in human consciousness that others haven't gone, or who are cleansed by wilderness. So there are these stories of Moses goes into the wilderness, and he travels, and he meets God in the form of an acacia bush, and that burns, but is not destroyed by fire, and it speaks to him the Creator's name, and this journey through wilderness is done without a guide, and in in certain native Australian cultures and others, there's a notion of walkabout that's performed as a ritual of becoming an adult, in certain cultures, and it's part of the ritual in most shamanistic initiations as well, where you venture into a place away, away from the securities of the community, and you learn to survive in solitude, a certain kind of solitude, and the space of journeying without a guide is the space of in which you make contact with the divine and the spirits of the place itself, and the knowledges that they give you and what you learn from them are the way that you survive in this place, and you learn to survive in this place because it gives you knowledge and of how to survive, and then this knowledge of how to survive you pass back into the community. So when Moses takes the liberated Israelites through the desert for 40 years, it takes 40 years because the generation that had this slave consciousness had to pass away, so that individuals who had experienced the benevolence of a creator, and sometimes not benevolence, because it wasn't a perfectly happy journey through the wilderness, right? But you have to accept and have faith that you can survive, and that your relationship to the world is not dependent upon the securities of those who have these resources and can grant you these resources, right? So this is the function of the solitary journey, is to bring back knowledge of how to survive and to give it to the community. And when you venture without a guide, you don't do that. It's a different kind of venture and a different relationship to seeing and a different relationship to the commitment to the continued survival and liberation of the community. And I thought about, this as a poetic project, and then and it plays itself out in really interesting ways. So like in Clay, I won't get into all of it, but in Clayton Eshelman's construct of poetic apprenticeship, you clearly have like this notion that is derived from Dante, and this notion that's derived from Virgil, of always needing a guide. And it's really interesting because his caves are not really that different in a certain way to these dark spaces that of the unknown that Dante goes into, right? But all of the holy ones, always, whether it was 40 days and nights in the desert, Christ's or Christ's solitude in the wilderness, or whether it was a whole community's 40 years in the wilderness, or whether it was the journey that Moses made before that, or whether it was the isolation of Purukatama, in his experiences of enlightenment, and, or whether it was the years of isolation that the Tibetan Buddhist Milarepa spent eating nettles in his cave. That this is this solitary journey marks the voyage of those seeking a certain kind of vision, and that vision it seems to me can be as it is in the story of Exodus and the survival of a people, the liberation of a people, and as it is in the Christian Gospels, it can be one in which the learning is brought to the community as a form of social transformation, or it can be the vision of this certain kind of means of enlightenment, but that it always requires this seeking and seeing, without a guide. And I guess I thought about that in terms of poetics and people like Bach and a large number of others, that their seeking was very, very much different than the seeking of survival and enlightenment. And or I guess I also thought about, in a strange way, I thought about my relationship with Jerome Rothenberg, and how his relationship to the world is so tied to the need for seeing alongside the guide. And I think one of the reasons for this is that Jerry has certain limitations in the way that he can travel through space, and I think that but I think that those limitations are largely like a result of, I may be wrong, but I think those limitations are largely a result of fear, and never having had to venture on one's own. So I've never known Jerry to go anywhere without a guide, and he rarely drives more than a few miles on his own anywhere, and I don't think he can navigate. when I used to have coffee with him, he would always inevitably choose the spot about 5 miles away from his home, the Panikin. And then if I, wanted to meet him elsewhere, he would always, be accompanied either by Diane or, maybe Matthew would drive him, his son Matthew, or, uh, or I would go pick him up, or, and then I realized at some point that this was the way that he experienced the world. That when he was in the army, there was a kind of structure. When he travels with a guide, and he goes. There might be a fellow poet, or when he goes to China, he has a guide, and when he goes to Mexico, he has a guide, and and Jerry's an interesting example because he's one of these poets who constructs these hells, and I was thinking about like the profundity of this. It seems like something of a loose connection, but it's not, right. There's a certain notion of these realms of the afterworld and the way that they function as punishments, and they begin in fear, and they're realms of fear, and and they're realms of space as uninhabitable or terrifying thing, and not being able to find one's way, and so one has to have a guide. One has to have someone who knows the terrain, even if that terrain is just within the boundaries of what should be your own imaginable world. So the last meeting that I had with Jerry, um, I'm sure that it'll be our final meeting, was in Julian, California, and it's, I don't know, maybe 40, possibly 40 or 45 miles away from the house that he's lived in for decades, 50 years in Encinitas, and not only did Jerry need a guide, had his son Matthew had to take him to our meeting in Julian, but even Matthew had a hard time, and probably without the technology of whatever the navigators are that we have now. I never use them, so I don't even know what they're called. But I don't know if Matthew would have known the way, and my experience of the area that I grew up in, Southern California, is much different because I've always ventured without a guide, and the way that we experience space and time is a reflection of the way that we construct our notion of human community and human society, and I think this is why the holy ones have to make these ventures. I think it's the profoundest and deepest symbolic significance of the walkabout, that like in order to capture the maps of the dreamings, the ancient maps, that you need to do this on your own, and in conjunction with the spirit and the spirits that inhabit the space and traverse space and time, and there's a certain amount of like fear that you have to abandon to do this, or you won't survive. And I think that we're at this point now where in the survival of humanity and this world itself, there's a certain amount of fear that we have to abandon in order to relearn, how to survive and care for this world. And I fear that we won't. And I fear that the fear, will only be stoked by the capitalism's desire to consume us and to profit from all of our fears and doubts and that if we don't learn or relearn like how to explore the space in which we remember how to survive, that we won't. So I'm very much concerned like that we spend less time launching infernos into outer space than relearning how to take those journeys into the darkness that we require in order to build our understanding of who we are and the freedoms that we and strengths and resources that we have within us that will allow us to make the necessary sacrifices to continue to survive in this world and to promote a fearless engagement with the struggle to survive and to thrive and to embrace and to love deeply in this place that belongs to us and to which we belong as well.